Hey there, and welcome to the Fear Factor, the podcast that shines a light on real stories, smart strategies, and the occasional hard truth about running a business. Think of this as your quick dose of clarity before your first cup of coffee. Let's go. Today's going to be a great day. I have the pleasure to speak with Brian King. He's an entrepreneur, finance guy, I'm guessing as well, and has created an awesome company called LODAS Markets. Thank you for taking the time today, Brian.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
And all the way from Overland Park, Kansas,
That's right. Right in the middle of the country.
right in the middle, dead square. And Kansas City is such a great fun town, and I've spent some time there. So good stuff. So thank you for taking the time. Can you just tell us first a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so Lotus Markets, we are a stock exchange for alternative investments. Effectively, what that means is for people when they're invested in alternative investments, typically there is a lack of liquidity. So it's not easily able to sell. So what I wanted to be able to do is create a stock exchange that allows investors to be able to exit when they want to be able to exit and allows people to buy when they want to be able to buy, maybe something on a secondhand basis. And then in addition to that, we also operate a transfer agent, which is kind of the infrastructure behind alternative investments.
Wow, that sounds complicated. How did you decide to start this thing?
Well, I've spent most of my career in the stock exchange world. So my earliest days were I was a part of a startup team of a company called Bats Exchange. We grew to be the second largest exchange by volume in the industry. And then I moved over to London. I built Bats Europe and I moved back and we started an options exchange and an ETF business, et cetera. So, and then we ultimately had an exit to the Chicago Board of Options. They bought us around that time. I left and I went to the New York Stock Exchange. So I've spent my entire career in and around stock exchanges, making things that are already liquid more liquid, making them easier to trade, et cetera. But what I really thought would be a great opportunity is to build something that allowed things that didn't trade, allow those to be able to trade.
Yeah, so this was a this had not been done before. You came up with this idea and said, "I'm going to rock and roll."
That's right. So on the secondary market side, yes, that is the case. There's always been ways for people to be able to sell their shares, but it's very inefficient. And usually it's like you have to find somebody that's willing to be a buyer. And so there's like some brokerage transactions. The fees historically have been really high, but it's a lot of paper. There's nothing that's automated. For us, if you want to be able to find the best price, the best thing you can do is be able to create a marketplace that allows multiple people to bid on those different offerings. And so, because we don't live in a very technologically advanced ecosystem for alternatives, one of the biggest hurdles that we had was the transfer agent role. So, really being able to transfer ownership from person A to person B. So, that was why we started that second business, the transfer agent that I referenced.
So it's so cool. Have had the pleasure to interview a lot of folks that had one business that led to starting another business. So when do you figure out that jumping off point, and when do you decide also that you have an idea that's actually viable and that you can build and create a marketplace for?
Yeah, so when we started Lotus, I'll start with the first business, the secondary market business. When we first started it, it was at the beginning of COVID, and so we were already having the idea about that this would be a unique opportunity. But when COVID happened, it really put a spotlight on the need for liquidity, and so timing actually couldn't have been any better for being able to launch things. So the idea was already there, but kind of circumstances really accelerated the opportunity. And then oftentimes what winds up happening is hurdles, obstacles, et cetera, can lead you to say, okay, what I need to exist in this ecosystem doesn't already exist. So I'm going to solve the problem by building it. And then that actually has become even bigger than our secondary market. So really what we're looking at is things have grown dramatically. Opportunities have really kind of accelerated.
So do you do you fundraise for something like this? Because I imagine you develop a bunch of software, and like how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so we have had a couple of fundraises. Initially, we just raised a seed round. $3.5 million was our initials, I guess technically pre-seed, because a lot of what you have to do, not only do you have to build the technology for it, but we live in a regulated world. So we had to
Mm.
get regulatory approval from both FINRA and the SEC. So we had to become a broker dealer and an ATS. So an ATS, without getting too far into the weeds, is an alternative trading system. It functions a lot like a stock exchange, but has its regulatory oversight is FINRA. So therefore we have to be a broker dealer. So we have both the SEC and FINRA. So we had to go through all those approvals as well, which takes a lot of time and lawyers and things along those lines. So yes, pre-seed was essential.
You got this idea. It's conceptually makes sense. How do you get it from that to pitch deck to raising 3.5 million bucks?
Well, surprisingly, it was easier to raise that first round than what I would have ever imagined. I think
Huh.
there's a lot of people that realize that this is a real problem, given the fact that I'd had so much success in the stock exchange world, and the exit of Bats was, I think, at that time, and maybe even still is, the biggest exit in the history of Kansas, the state of Kansas. While I would love to say that it was all me, it was not. There was a big team, and I was a small piece of that success. And so, but regardless, no matter what role I played in that, I think there was the history of being able to build a marketplace in Kansas. It had happened, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of it. And so, really, what it did is it opened up the door, and people believed that story. Hey, it's really about storytelling. You have to be able to say, hey, this is the opportunity. This is how we're going to solve it, and we got a lot of people to believe in that.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I could see how because you'd worked in the space before or similar space that gave you some cred that other people maybe wouldn't have if they had come up with this idea. Yeah, you had the kind of the how, you knew how to do it, you had the credibility to be able to do it, and you could move on it, right?
Yeah, so I think one thing that might be the flip side of that, so I think you're exactly right. We've seen a lot of people try to attack this space that maybe have blockchain knowledge, and so they're
Uh-huh.
blockchain people that are trying to go in, and unfortunately, we've seen all those companies fail along the way. So there aren't a lot of people that have tried to do this because they don't come from the space, they don't have the credibility, but they have this tool called blockchain and they think that's how we're going to solve it. Well, now you're trying to make a tool solve a problem. You need to have some people that understand the actual problem and how the world actually works today to be able to do it. Blockchain might come in the future, but right now that's not the driving force of how we're going to solve the problem.
I think that's brilliant. Thinking about people, they get these tools. That could be AI, that could be, like you said, blockchain, some other tool. It's like that's neat and all, but having a tool and then fitting that to a problem is different than figuring out what the problem is and then the best solution. Correct?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay, so you got this thing off the ground. What was one of the biggest kind of challenges you had early on?
One of the biggest challenges I think, candidly, was the regulatory piece of
Hmm.
it. When you're in a regulatory environment and you're creating something that has not existed before, it's pushing a boulder uphill for sure. And so now your conversations with them are educating them on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and anytime you're dealing with the SEC or FINRA, their biggest concerns are what's the worst thing that could happen, right?
Ah,
And so they start with what's the worst thing and then work back from there. And so just getting somebody understanding what you're doing and then keeping that boulder moving forward so that you can actually get the approvals, that was probably the biggest challenge initially.
thinking about government and government regulation, I mean, I know they're planning for worst case scenarios, so I mean, I understand that, but yeah, that had to be a real challenge. And then how do you keep your investors? I guess you just manage expectations through that space.
Yes, you just have to manage expectations and be able to say, okay, this is what's going to get us from point A to point B, and then we have to say, okay, now we're launching. I think even when we're launching the business, now you have to get the people who are going to be the most likely candidates for using the platform, make sure that they're comfortable from a regulatory perspective. So again, more education, really educating the individual in users what the risk could potentially be. And in most cases, there really isn't a lot of risk. It's just helping them understand how they can use it internally, right? But yeah, so it's managing those expectations with investors.
And then you still had to sell this thing. to users. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so we use a combination of we didn't invest anything in marketing. Anything that we did was myself putting it on LinkedIn or having some initial wins and trying to focus on PR and leveraging relationships that we had in the media space to be able to talk about it. Media seemed to be fairly interested in this topic, so somebody who's trying to solve it, that really helped, being able to get some media behind us. And then we had a very small sales team, but just kind of getting some initial wins, leveraging existing relationships that you already have, and trying to get some of those early wins. But we had a fortunate event for us in 2022 that really helped us from a media perspective. One of the biggest sponsors in the space, called Blackstone, it's a household name. One of the biggest funds maybe in the world for alternatives is their BREIT fund. And so they started to have some liquidity issues based on kind of like macroeconomic environment stuff. Because of that, it caused there to be a bit of a run on the fund, people looking for liquidity. So there was a limitation as to how much liquidity they could provide. Lotus listed it on the marketplace. And because we were doing that, we were looked at as the white knight in the story. So now CNBC, Bloomberg, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, all those guys were very interested in our story. So anytime you can get somebody else to tell your story, it's a big, big win.
That is amazing. Build credibility, hit some mass media. So then I assume your company really started to scale. How did you plan for that growth, or how did you, manage that?
Yeah, so for us, we have tried to operate as lean as we possibly can. One of the things that's kind of unique, the fact that we're building a business in Kansas City, is that if we were building this business in New York, very likely we would have had a tremendous amount of additional capital being
Mm.
thrown our way, right? So, but instead, we were able to give away less of the company, but that meant we raised less money. And so we needed to operate on a pretty tight budget. So everybody wore multiple hats, and everybody, it's all hands on deck all the time. And then, once you have some wins, you're able to raise a little bit more capital. And so we just recently had a pretty significant raise that effectively we haven't announced it yet, but that's totally fine. But had some real wins, some real great partnerships along the way. And as you do that, you just have to make some plans to say, okay, here's what our roadmap looks like. These are the amount of people that are going to take to be able to do that. But we've seen in 2025, we've doubled our employees. So we went from, I think, going into 25, we only had 9 full-time employees, and I think right now we have 20.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. And the thing I've always found is like a lot of business owners when they hire the first one or two, maybe don't get that right. Did you have a better experience?
Yeah, so there are some things that you have to make some pivots along the way. There's some challenges certainly that presented themselves, and we had to make some changes. So I can't say that we got every hire right, but I think by and large, the team that we have is unbelievable. We literally couldn't have a better team. And I think some of the key people that we found along the way, to like my chief technology officer, he's been with us from day one. I could not have found a better person to be able to lead everything from a technology perspective. And so he's kind of been my right-hand man all the way through, and it's just been amazing. But so that's a real gift. If you can find that right secondhand person to kind of go along with you, that you can trust implicitly, somebody that understands about the business, really cares about the business, and then is a fantastic engineer on top of it, that has just been a real, real gift.
Man, that makes all the difference. And then you got a teammate. And I'm guessing especially with a startup like this, you got to have somebody that's willing to go in for the long haul and through the grind and be scrappy and do whatever it takes. Right.
That's exactly right. And in fact, I think that's kind of each person that we look to hire, they have to be that. Some of the areas where we've found that we needed to make some changes along the way, they were typically people who we thought were going to be that ultimately weren't that. It's You have people that are used to, if they have experience behind them, they maybe have run teams now, and so they don't necessarily, they're not the person that's ultimately going to roll their sleeves up and do all the work. They want to go and hire a team to go and do all the work. Right at our stage, we need people that say, "Hey, I have the experience not only in rolling up my sleeves and doing the work, but also managing a team. So when it comes time to manage that team, I've got that experience too, but I also know how to get things done from day one."
Man, that's really smart. Because I think a lot of people would potentially hire the person that could do the job right now, but to think about the next level of team management and hiring people that could go to the next level from the start, but aren't afraid to do the work. That's brilliant. Thumbs up on that because that, as you see companies scale, what I've seen a lot of times happen is like, oh wait, the people that got me here can't get me to the next level because they're not prepared to run that team.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that we internally refer to them as unicorns, when you think about an engineer that has great engineering capabilities, they're great at coding, really understand business, that type of thing. Oftentimes somebody gets to a certain level of seniority from an engineering perspective, and the next level is managing. And so for us to find that person that has that level of experience that can contribute day one, they're doing amazing things from a coding perspective, but they don't need to be managing today. That's been a hard person to find. And so, we're very, very choosy about the people that we do hire. Hiring process takes way longer than any of us would like, but it's so important to get it right.
Man, that's for sure. So, what was one thing you would do differently if you're going to do it over again?
One thing I would do differently, candidly, I probably would have raised a little more money up front than what I did. I think we could have raised more money up front. I do believe that would have made it a little bit easier. I never wanted to raise too much because if you raise too much money, one, you might be giving away too much of the company. But the
Mm.
second piece of that really is if you raise too much money, oftentimes you spend money on things that you don't need to spend money on. So it's harder to be disciplined when you have all the money sitting in the bank account. You're saying I can spend money on that. So being intentional and disciplined is challenging. We probably went maybe too early or too conservative on how much we initially raised. And then the markets turned really fast and it became really challenging to raise that next, what would probably be called a true seed round. We had that pre seed, but
Uh-huh.
raising that next seed round when you're okay, now we're just starting to find our early legs of success. We need people that are going to continue to invest in that next vision. Again, coming out of COVID and money was really becoming challenging to raise. That probably gave me a few more gray hairs than I would have liked.
Yeah, it's fair to think about, and the thing I've found with businesses, even businesses that aren't trying to raise funding or whatever, I always say it takes twice as long, it's twice as hard, and it takes twice as much money. So maybe it didn't need twice as much, but a little bit more could have helped you scale a little faster. Correct?
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Okay, so what like long term then? What does this business look like when it's finished? Is this global? Where does it go?
So that's a great question, and I think I've done a lot of, let's call it, soul searching recently. I think when I initially set out, the idea was, hey, I want to build something that's really cool, makes a dramatic impact, and ultimately is going to be sold to somebody. And there's plenty
Sure.
of people out there that I think would be acquirers of the business. As we've gone along, we've realized there are so many places that we could grow, and I think we're really hitting on a lot of different pain points for people in the industry.
Hmm.
And I think that this could grow to be a mega company. And so we have I'm not going to disclose where we think we're going to be in 5 years from a financial perspective, but we have a pretty aggressive roadmap of what we think where we're going to be in 5 years. And I actually view us as the possibility of, taking this public. As a guy who comes from the exchange world, IPO is attractive. Like on a personal level, I think it's really cool when you see companies go kind of full cycle. I love the idea of that. I'm a you know markets guy, capital markets guy, so I love that thought process. And if I could run a company that's public, I think that would be fantastic. But there's so many areas that we could pivot into, like add on, that are very complementary to what we already have. I just think that the sky's the limit as to what we could be. And so that's really exciting.
That's so cool. So you can build it vertically and build it horizontally.
Yeah,
And
that's
the fact
exactly
that
right.
you only have 20 people right now, I mean, it's double what you did have, but you're still like you're scrappy and lean, and you're not talking about this massive overhead thing that's gonna, that you really got it. That you're kind of, I don't know. You have to deliver a big nut every month just to cover it.
That's right. So we're trying to keep it as lean as possible. We have half of our team is engineers, and they are, automating everything that we can possibly automate so that we are able to keep those numbers low. It helps us increase the margins on everything that we do financially. And so yeah, that's a very key part of our strategy is, hiring the right engineers that help us automate things that allow us to keep we are a service industry, so it is important to be able to have people, very competent people that can build relationships, have relationships with the in sponsors or wealth firms, et cetera. But it's so much better if we can allow them to actually be a relationship person versus somebody who's manually doing reports and mainly doing these all these different operational things. The more we can automate that, I think the better we'll be able to scale.
I'm guessing AI is a component for y'all.
AI is a component, and as we look forward, we anticipate it being an even bigger component. There's a lot of areas where we can leverage AI, but yeah, we're just kind of getting started in that realm, but it already plays a pretty big role.
What's your biggest right now?
Right now, our biggest challenge is probably time. I mean, we know that there's all these things that we want to be able to do, and even though we have fantastic engineers, some of these projects are pretty monstrous.
Mm.
We are moving into a world where it's very institutionalized, and so when you're a 20-person team and you're working with the Blackstones of the world and the Aries and the Apollos and all of that, like what you have to be able to do functionally to be able to meet their needs is is pretty significant. And we have we've built things that are just most people would think are inconceivable to have built in as short of time as what we've been around. But so there's no shortage of things that we want to be able to build, and it's just being able to build it, have enough time to be able to build those things.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you seem like a person that has a positive mindset, and I think anybody that's going to build something from scratch has to have that. How do you protect attitude, mindset? How do you protect the team and keep them all focused?
No, I think it's a great question. Now, I'm probably to a fault an overly optimistic person, and that's just who I am by nature. But I think talking about hiring the right people, culture is every bit as important as talent, right? And so we are very, very choosy about making sure that we have the right people around the table. And so culture is important. We want people that are also optimistic, but I also love to be able to have people that have different ways of thinking too, right? I want people that can challenge me and can be able to say, here's the other side of this particular scenario and can actually do that, but it has to be healthy, right? It needs to be a situation where we're able to do that in a very healthy environment and challenge each other's in positive ways. So, but yeah, that hiring the right people that are willing to stand up and have strength behind what they say, but at the same time, not not be an ass if I'm allowed to say it.
I like it. But healthy. I think healthy environment is exactly right. And the thing is, as a leader, if somebody challenges us and we don't handle it right, they're never going to challenge us again, and we're not going to get the information. And pretty soon, we're the emperor walking around with no clothes on.
That's a great analogy, but yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for me, I consider myself to be a pretty bright person, but at the same time, I am not afraid to have people that are smarter than me in certain areas or all areas or whatever around me. I'm not intimidated by that. It's something that I learned early on in my career that you want to surround yourself with people that are really brilliant and they will help elevate you. And it's all about team for me. And so it's exciting to have those people around me contributing in various ways.
Yeah, I heard. I wish I could remember who said this. Somebody said this saying, which I love: "If you're the smartest person in the room, you're probably in the wrong room."
That's right. That's right. I don't know who said that. I've heard that before, and I think that is spot on. Yeah, for me, it's also just always I never stop being curious, and I think when you're talking to entrepreneurs, that's the number one thing. It's just always be curious. Like try to figure out what's around the corner. What is this other person doing in this particular area? Like what could we be doing different? And just always be learning and. It's going to apply at some point. Maybe not everything that you learn is going to apply, but just continuing to be curious. And I'd love to be curious about the things that other people on my team where I'm not into the weeds. I like to know what they're doing, not so that I can micromanage them, but just so I can better understand it. So if I ever have to articulate it, I understand it. If I know what their problems are, I understand those. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Intellectual curiosity is such a key piece for success for any organization. It's almost especially again in something that's a startup from scratch. So did you ever, like, I don't know if you have a family or not, but if you have a family, was there ever a point where they're like, "What the heck are you doing? Can you just go back and get a job?"
Yes, that has happened, and I'm very fortunate. My wife is very supportive of, anything that I do, but so she's always been super encouraging. She tries to understand what we do, but doesn't come from the finance world, so it's an inside our house joke about what it actually is that I do. But my daughters are old enough that one graduated college and is working on her master's right now, and my youngest daughter is in college currently. But my oldest has actually interned for me 3 summers. So she played from early on. She played a role in helping us before we were even live. She was pulling stuff from the SEC's website, and she didn't really know what she was like looking for, but it was very, very materially helpful.
That's so cool. Family
Yeah.
business.
Yeah, so it's been great. Everybody has a stake in this for sure in our house.
That's more. Everybody's all in.
That's
Okay,
right.
so if you had one piece of advice for somebody that was going to start up I mean, really any kind of business, what would be a good nugget that somebody could take away?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I have to just narrow it down to one, I mean, I think the biggest thing is you can never do too much planning, right? But you
Right.
can't allow planning to prevent you from getting started, right? So be planning, be thinking, but you ultimately have to get started. Get people around you to that are, again, we already said this, but people that are smarter than you that can add, whether they're a part of your company or just advisory, right?
Mm.
Somebody that you can just pick their brain. I think that that's really critically important. And I would also, the last thing would just say that as much as planning that you can do, know that there's going to be changes, right?
Mm.
You're going to have to make pivots. You're going to have to make, and a lot of times I've always been against that word. I hate the word pivot, but I always feel like it has a negative connotation. But a pivot doesn't have to be a 180-degree turn, right? It can be, 20 degrees where you're just like shifting a little bit of your focus to go to say, okay, this path is not working exactly right. So now we're just going to focus this way and move in this direction a little bit. But just being able to be flexible and open-minded allows you to not die on the road.
Yeah, there's so much there. By the way, when I hear pivot, I think of pivot, where Ross and
Friends, yep.
friends are trying to get the couch up the stairs. So I think number one, having a trusted advisor is so cool. And so there's a plug for me for what I do, because a lot of coaching honestly is pulling out of somebody stuff they already know, blinding flashes of the obvious, but having some perspective and being up in the press box versus being out in the field can really make a big difference. So there's that. The second thing I wanted to capture was it seems like I have this common theme when I talk to folks, and that is make a decision, get the product into the customer's hands, and then iterate the product as the customer wants it. Because what we think the customer wants isn't always what the customer wants. So why build the perfect mousetrap and then you put it out in the field and then it's not what the customer wanted at all?
No, that is 100% spot on. And I think when we were first building it, we had to start with what we knew, what we thought was the right approach. But then, you have to evolve and get things to say, okay, that this was what we initially thought it was going to be, but there's some modifications that we need to make. Well, as we start to launch new areas of our business or even new like product features, et cetera, we're now at the stage where we say, listen, we're going to find somebody that we can, that needs this. We're going to work with them to be the beta for it.
Yes.
We give them special pricing to be that beta person. And then like, let's work on this together. We're going to help solve your problem, but we'll allow, you'll be the first person. We'll give you special pricing for it. But now I know that if it works for them, it's going to work for others. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have some additional iterations to it, but that allows you to kind of get it out there and test it and have it in real production.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so I'm going to ask, I have 3 questions for speed round, but then I have to ask a fourth most important question first. You're from Kansas City, so Kansas City barbecue, Texas barbecue, any thoughts on that? North Carolina?
So I have become a Kansas City barbecue guy. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and in Florida there is quite a bit of barbecue down there. And believe it or not, when we first moved to Kansas City in 2005, we actually shipped our barbecue sauce, as crazy as that sounds, from Jacksonville to here. Anytime somebody would, like friends would come up to visit us, we'd ask them, hey, can you bring a couple of bottles of, and it was the Sonny's barbecue, if you're familiar with it in the South.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love their sweet and I also love their mustard. But fortunately, I've since found those that I don't have to import my barbecue sauce. And there's also been some new restaurants here in Kansas City that are just big, like, amazing barbecue restaurants. I'm a big barbecue guy.
That's awesome. Yeah, Kansas City's such a great town. Have you ever been to Stroud's? Is Stroud
Yep.
still there? We
Yep.
choke our
Shrouds is
own
still here.
chickens.
Yep. It is.
Okay,
Yes.
good spot. Institutional. Okay, so 3 quick questions. Number one, what do you want to be when you grow up?
That's a funny question. I guess outside of being the CEO of this company as a public company, that's certainly something I want to do. Some people may know this, but my early on ambitions were to be on Broadway. So
Oh,
someday, if we ever have an exit, even if I have to pay my way to be on Broadway, just so I can check that box and say, "Yep, I did it." That's my dream. That's what I want to do when I grow up.
singing, dancing,
So
acting, all the above?
singing, acting, somewhere way lower is or was dancing. But yeah, so I'm most my strongest thing is that I'm a singer. So occasionally I put out recordings and stuff like that just when I have time. I have not had a lot of time recently, but I do have a YouTube channel that occasionally I put out something.
That is incredible. What's the YouTube channel?
I can't remember exactly what it is. It's my name, Brian King,
Brian King on YouTube
on
doing some
YouTube. Yeah.
songs. That's awesome. I got to check that out. I'm definitely doing that. And what are you people going to say about you when you're gone? What do you want them to say about you?
It's a good question. I don't typically get asked that question. I want people to think of me for my character, that I genuinely liked, that people genuinely liked to work with me, that I was a servant-hearted, person, that I basically led from a servant position. That yeah, I think that's what I want people to think of me from a business perspective. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I just applaud you on building this thing from scratch and your amazing success. And I can't wait to see where your company goes. And someday maybe I'll be able to buy a piece of it on the stock exchange.
There you go. I love it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. And I'm totally checking out your YouTube channel next.
Sounds great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Warren. Appreciate it.
Brian King, what great perspective. First of all, positive attitude, stay positive, surround yourself with super smart people, smarter than you in a lot of cases. Let them challenge you, and then build a product and get it into the customer's hands and let them decide what we should do with it and how we should iterate it. Pretty amazing to take something from nothing and turn it into something that could be a publicly traded company in a few years. Also, he's a fellow tuba major like me. So we're music nerds as well as just regular nerds. So anyway, great guy. Thoroughly enjoyed Brian.
Liked what you heard? Let's make it real. Schedule your free coaching session today at sugarland.actioncoach.com.